Hi, welcome to the Data Defender Forum episode number 2. My name is Sylvain Kalache and I am joined by my great partner, Bart Farrell. So in today's episode, we are going to speak about private SaaS. And joining us for this conversation are Michel Tricot, the co-founder and CEO at Airbyte. Airbyte is a new open source ELT standard for replicating data from application, API, and databases. We also have Arul Jegadish Francis, the co-founder at OpsVerse, which provides fully managed open source DevOps tool that can run anywhere. Hello to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Hey guys.
Thank you, Sylvain and Bart.
Welcome.
Welcome. So before we jump in the conversation, let's go over a quick briefing on the situation. So the SaaS market today is roughly around 251 billion and planning on reaching 883 billions by 2029, excuse me. That's a lot of billions. Actually today, 50% of the software that company uses are SaaS. And most IT decision maker said that SaaS would be the biggest growth in the cloud area. So it's here to stay. But for many companies, using SaaS is not an option because of security standard, data regulation laws. Industry like healthcare and finance historically have very high security standard, but now any companies that store customer data have to respect some sort of standards. And with 71% of countries having some sort of data regulation or legislation law, it's not going anywhere. One example is data residency requirements that require a nation citizens' data to be collected, processed, and stored inside the country where they are from. Not respecting this can lead to serious fine and sanction. For instance, American Express and Diner Club were recently forbidden to issue new card in India because they were not respecting data storage rule, which is a big deal for Diner Club, which has the largest share in India of credit card, which is quite interesting. So let's get started. Arul, can you give me what's your definition of private SaaS?
Sure. So we all already know about SaaS. So SaaS is where a provider or a vendor takes a piece of software, manages it completely, and offers it as a service. Now, private SaaS is where you actually push that software or the data managed by that software to the customer's own infrastructure or to a certain region. So that makes it private SaaS. So in which case, the particular piece of software becomes private to that particular set of users or customers. But at the same time, the vendor brings in all the benefits of SaaS, like managing all aspects of running that tool, upgrading it, taking care of security, providing reliability guarantees, etc. So basically, you would split the control plane and data plane and make the data plane live where the customer wants it to live. That's private SaaS.
You got it. And can you give in the context of your company, can you explain, in very specific business-centric use case, what does it mean for OpsVerse?
Sure. So OpsVerse provides a OSS-based managed DevOps tools platform. So we basically bring in various DevOps tools on top of the platform. So in our case, we provide our customers with tools that touch their version control system, their production system, basically the sensitive parts of their software delivery pipeline. So in our use case, what we do is the tools themselves are run within the customer's own network, whether it's their cloud account or whether it's their data center. The tools are executed within the customer's data residency, data governance perimeter, but the control plane on how we manage those tools lives in our cloud. So in our case, so the line is between the tools themselves and the control plane.
Thank you. Michel, can you brief us on Airbyte? Like, what does this separation means for you? And also, why did you decide, to do that?
Yeah. So Airbyte is an open source data movement platform. And whenever we talk about private SaaS, it's generally that you have a boundary around something that you manage that cannot leave your control. And in general, this is data. Like, people don't want data to leave the safety of their cloud, the safety of their databases. And what we discovered with Airbyte open source, that there are a lot of vendors that do data movement. But the reason why people were taking open source was because the moment you have open source, it means that you're taking the software and you are running it within your own infrastructure. The thing is, by doing that, you're losing the value that SaaS brings you. Like, SaaS brings you, as Arul was saying, this gives you like software upgrade. Even for the company to develop, it's easier to develop on SaaS because you can have very short cycle of development and releases, which is very different than when you ship software. And for us, the moment we discover that, okay, this is the reason why people want that. It's not so much for they want to own the software. It's just that they want to own where the data is actually moving. This is when we decided to say, okay, Airbyte is split in two pieces, one that is called the control plane, one that is called the data plane. And from there, you can decide the piece that's really matter for them as a private SaaS is data plane is controlled by their IT team, by their infrastructure. And that's why we're making that split between control plane and data plane. And interestingly, we actually dogfooded this split for the cloud product of Airbyte, which is, you said we have GDPR, you have CCPA, there are some regulation, like geographic regulation, and Airbyte is operating this way, which is we have one control plane that only contains configuration, user management, but the rest, like credentials and where the data is actually moving, can actually go from one cloud to another, from one geography to another, and the user has the choice to decide, yes, I want the data to run there. But this is for cloud, but this is basically the same thing that then happened to potential customer, which is, I have my infrastructure, let's run the data plane on my cloud. But yeah, the driver is always the security and the control over your data.
And you announced this as part of the Europe launch. Like, was there a specific reason or story where was it not possible for users to run Airbyte prior to this, or it was complicated or difficult? Like, is there a backstory to this?
I think it's just, we started by releasing open source, and we looked at our daily active user or people that are working with Airbyte open source and try to figure out where are the different markets. And it was very clear that, yes, we have a massive chunk in Northern America, and we also have a very big chunk in Europe. Now for cloud, the first time we released it, and that's also because we're a startup, we focused on let's launch it in the US, but very, very quickly, because we have this ambition of moving data everywhere, we very quickly created that split between the control plane and the data plane. And for us, the testing ground for that model was, let's expand to Europe. Let's get all the customers that are ready for us in Europe. Let's address their needs. But yeah, the need was really a commercial one, which is there is a large audience for Airbyte in Europe. And if we just run in the US, we cannot address it, especially because we're a data product.
Very interesting. I think Bart.
Yeah. No. And related to that is that, we have an interesting mixture of, two Europeans living in the US and American living in Europe, people in different places that are not where they originally weren't. What I'm going for with this, though, is that for people that are working in the data space or that are thinking about, building a private SaaS, is it safe to say that they simply cannot be thinking locally? Because in a good situation, you're going to have customers that are in these other places. Sylvain touched on briefly in the beginning an article that was shared by Arul about, how difficulties around data storage for credit card companies in India. All of a sudden, something that might not be a problem in one place is a problem in another. What is it that companies that are developing, private SaaS should be keeping in mind? They might be thinking, well, I'm coming from a technical background, but all of a sudden your technical background has a lot to do with international regulations around data protection, data security, compliance. Arul, what advice would you give to companies that are out there trying to develop a private SaaS in that sense of think globally from the very beginning?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I want to touch on that Michel mentioned as well is when you get into private SaaS, when you're thinking about private SaaS, I think you should first think about dogfooding your own SaaS implementation, just how you are thinking about private SaaS. And that's the way we do it as well. We have a SaaS offering and a private SaaS offering, and we operate both the offerings very similarly. Even our SaaS, where we have the control plane and the data plane is separated, so we dogfood that. So otherwise you are gonna do your operations in two different ways, and then it'll be very difficult for you to develop. So that's number one. Your SaaS offering, private SaaS, you should operate them very similar. And secondly, if you're thinking about coming into private SaaS, this whole separation of control plane and data plane is very important, because it's usually the data plane is where all these regulations come in. Regulations, data residency, data governance. So as long as your data plane can move around anywhere, can live anywhere, I think you are good. So that should be part of your base architecture. On day one, you should actually think about that. A few other operational areas that you have to think about are your ability to run hundreds of single-tenant systems. In traditional SaaS, often you are dealing with one multi-tenant system. With private SaaS, implicitly, every instance is going to be a single-tenant system. So your architecture, your deployment architecture, your operations framework should support hundreds of single-tenant systems. So that's, again, a first principle. You should be able to support that. Then this whole remote management, you're going to deploy to and operate infrastructure that you cannot touch and see. You cannot see. Your engineers will not have direct access to that infrastructure. So you should be able to handle that. This whole remote management, you should be able to do that. And then observability. You should have really deep and robust observability infrastructure so that you know the health of what you're operating remotely. And you're going to run about hundreds of these instances remotely. So your observability framework should be robust enough to bring everything in. And again, I think you can try out all this by dogfooding your SaaS itself. You can develop your SaaS to dogfood this and then think about private SaaS.
Great, thank you. And Michel, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with the point where, as engineers, you want to build a product, and then suddenly you have this external force that's coming on top of your product. And I always put that, we work in data, so for me, everything is about data. But this is one place where if you are in the data space, you need to bring people that have that sensitivity around what are the requirements of data. And sometimes you don't have to be an expert, but you need to know that you have regulation. People care so much about the security of their data that you have to protect it. The one is how do you access that data? What secrets do you have? And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a legal expert, but you do have to bring a team that have that sensitivity, because they will also make the right choices. And when we built Airbyte, I come from a pretty large data company and one that was operating globally. And I actually brought some people with me that, even though they were not experts, they had been living and breathing every type of decision that is made to make data safe. And then it becomes something that is encoded into your development practices. Now, we also brought a data regulation expert with us to just help us on certification, security diagram, etc., etc. because yes, we're dealing with people's data, and whether it's on the private SaaS or whether it's on the public SaaS or whether it's on open source, we need to ensure that we build very strong foundation from the beginning. So yeah, that's mostly what I have to add. I would say the thing about observability, this is a big deal because in a way you can almost consider that observability and getting some telemetry from single tenant deployment or like a private SaaS deployment is a type of data. So by doing private SaaS, you're not also completely removing the scrutiny that companies put on your company and on your product, because you're still establishing a link between their infrastructure and your infrastructure. And that could be seen as a point of failure in terms of security. So it's not a silver bullet, but it reduces the blast radius in case there is something happening. But you will still have to explain something there. So it's not a silver bullet, but it definitely helps on like the day-to-day.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation in the first episode of the Data Defender Forum where one of the guests who is a lawyer said that he was working with software vendor in when GDPR was about to come. And one thing he said that I thought was very interesting is that software companies cannot possibly make their software compliant to every single data regulation that there is out there. Today there is 137 countries who have some type of data protection law. But what software vendor can do is make their software capable of being in compliance. And so I think that's what private SaaS is doing in some way. It's empowering end user to put in place the security and the law that they need to respect. But with that comes also some, I mean, it's a choice. I think, like, I guess most companies would use SaaS if they can, perhaps private SaaS as a secondary option. But one question I have to both of you, do you provide like best practices when it comes to, for instance, security or how to be in compliance when it comes to for your user to use your software? So is it something you take responsibility, like providing guidance to help them?
Yeah, so for everything that is private SaaS related, for us, this is still something that is in the beginning. So there is also a pretty large like learning phase. Now, I would almost consider the open source deployment at that point like a child of SaaS, like private SaaS, which is we don't own the control plane at that point, like our customers do. But we definitely help on best practices on how do you create your deployment, how you build security around it. And one thing that we're actually working on right now is additional like packages that are very security related around like how do you expand the software within your organization rather than leaving it within your team. Like everything around like SSO, role access management, audit logs. Like these are things that you need to have the moment you start dealing with data. You need to understand who is making changes, how they're making changes, what kind of changes they're making. So there is something there. Today you can already get it, but people have to pull this information outside of Airbyte. And what we want is to really push it to observability system and audit systems. But one thing that we actually started to do on open source is, for example, just very simple, detecting when someone is installing Airbyte on a public instance, something that is accessible from the outside. Because it seems obvious that this is not something you should be doing, but sometimes just for simplicity, you're just going to spin up an instance, run the software there, make it get accessible through the outside. And because Airbyte is a data software that is used to move data, it becomes a very good place where to try to gain access to. So right now we've put a lot of protection in open source to actually protect our open source users. So even if they don't look at the documentation, it is in the software where we run these checks of, hey, can I access Airbyte from the outside? If it is, we're just telling you. You can still do it, but we're telling you. And that's one way for us of self-serving the good practices. Try not to do it. But yeah, that's definitely something that we're pushing for.
Arul, is there anything that OpsVerse is doing or want to do in the future regarding that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to private SaaS, the users / customers do look forward to the vendor for some of these guidelines. So in our case, again, as Michel mentioned, with private SaaS, since you still have that observability telemetry coming out and all that, so there's still that link. And so what we do is we provide enough guidance around how to make this link like as secure as possible, how to ensure the blast radius is like as minimum as possible with respect to establishing this link and with respect to running the OpsVerse software within the customer's account. So we do have like set of guidelines that we provide our customers around that. With respect to private SaaS, this is definitely an expectation from the vendors to help their users out.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you get from private SaaS, and the reason why people want this type of deployment model is because they've already set up good practices internally. If you have to be PCI compliant, you have already hardened your system. And what you want is and in general, it's not specific to systems. It's almost like they create the right boundaries, the right observability for any software that gets installed within this type of environment. And that's the reason why private SaaS is very appealing to companies, because now they've already proven that the system is safe and they want to deploy within a safe system. So sometimes our customers are more expert than us in what does it mean to deploy in a PCI compliant environment, because they have it, they have all the security measures in place, and they just know I can drop the software and it's going to be automatically compliant because it runs in a monitored and secure system.
And with that in mind, it's interesting because, as you said, some customers need a little bit of extra support or training, and that's where you have to have those internal resources to be able to provide that. Do you feel, though, that there are any particular industries or use cases where private SaaS is particularly well suited? When we talk about data protection, we're often speaking about telecommunications, healthcare, government data, things of that nature, obviously financial services. Arul, are there any particular industries or use cases where you think it's a better match than others?
Yeah, so I think naturally for fintech and healthcare organizations, this becomes almost a mandatory requirement where they do have to fulfill various data regulations, data handling regulations. So it's a natural requirement there in those industries, and we see that with our customer base as well. The kind of customers who opt for private SaaS are mostly fintech and healthcare in our case. But at the same time, now we actually OpsVerse, we deal with like DevOps tools, where almost any organization, when it comes to DevOps tools, your tools are going to touch the most sensitive part of your infrastructure. It's going to touch your version control. It's going to touch your production deployment system, and it's going to touch everything in between. So even if you are in an industry where data regulations are not a big deal, you may still want to, just from a general security practice, you may still want to consider keeping these tools within your data governance, within your network perimeter. But to answer your question, we in the field, we are seeing the initial uptake from fintech and healthcare organizations and companies residing in a geographical region where like the European Union, where they have additional data protection regulations.
And it's good. It's something as well too in the conversation Sylvain and I have been having when we talk about stakeholders, because like you said, okay, you're talking about DevOps teams, but they're also having access to very delicate parts of infrastructure to say, look, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, I have nothing to do with that. where do we draw the line, in terms of who's going to bear the responsibility? And that's something that a lot of organizations are wrestling with. And once again, inside the European Union, it's one thing, outside it's another. So being familiar with those things, and once again, folks coming from a technical background, suddenly feeling like they have legal obligations, which they may not feel like they're properly trained on. We have this sort of finger pointing of, it's in your hands, it's in my hands, it's, Chief Data Protection Officer. In my particular case, I was working for a British startup in 2018 when GDPR came out. And of course, it was also, right around the same time Brexit was happening. So then additional questions started getting asked. And so getting to the point we're at now, and, global organizations that are remote first, people all over the world, I think it's something that's being better built into their DNA. So like you said, though, Arul, is that, DevOps teams also are going to be part of the equation. Michel, anything that you've noticed that's more industry specific of, particular use cases that are better aligned for private SaaS?
I mean, I'm going to repeat what Arul said. When, fintech is one, but healthcare is a very big one. I think here is just, and sometimes it's also that people don't know what they can and cannot do. And they prefer to go for the safest option, even though a cloud solution could be something like, for example, a very simple example is Airbyte cloud. We don't store data. In the healthcare industry, Airbyte can be considered to be a HIPAA conduit. The same way the post office is a HIPAA conduit. Like the post office is moving letters from the doctor office to the patient, and they don't need to be HIPAA compliant. Although in the letters you have PHI, you have information about about people's health, and it's the same thing for data. But even though they're fine sending letters, when it comes to the data world and in the digital world, it changes their perspective. And they're educated on the paper side, but they might not be on the data side. And they could be using Airbyte Cloud, but they prefer to be on the extra safe side. And that's why they go for this type of solution. So yeah, I agree. Like here, education or like having standard that can be a little bit clearer on what you can and cannot do would be a big help for this industry that is really looking to get more modernization in how they deal with data, how they deal with information transmission. So yeah, like healthcare is a big one. Like many of our open source user or people that are looking to get into this hybrid model are from the health industry.
So how do you see today, like a few months ago, I Googled private SaaS and there were like nearly nothing, and now you Google private SaaS and Palantir is speaking about it, so it's becoming a thing. That's a question for both of you, and Arul, you can start. Like how do you see the private SaaS trend fitting into the broader landscape of enterprise software?
Yeah, I think when we started OpsVerse, this was part of the founding thesis because we saw this as a gap in the industry. And now in the last 18 months, we do see a lot of other vendors talking about it, and also some standard like Palantir, right? Some standard operating models emerging as well. We see, like at least in the DevOps world, we see a lot of vendors either announcing support for something that looks like private SaaS, addressing that problem, or vendors who already have support for that. Like we saw it from like Preset, which is a data visualization platform. They have what they call it as a managed private cloud, which is private SaaS, their terminology for that. We see GitLab moving towards single tenant systems, even though it still runs in their cloud. We see it from Gitpod is something that's now supporting private SaaS. So we do see this coming from various vendors. So as we go, we'll definitely see this as a standard model of delivery tools or delivery software, especially the data ops, DevOps, MLOps world to begin with. And as we go, obviously, we will see some standard frameworks and standard ways of operating private SaaS. Like when it comes to SaaS, there are definitely standard ways to run. When it comes to self-hosted, open source self-hosted world, also there are standard ways of shipping your software and supporting it. Similarly, we'll definitely see a lot of, in the enterprise world, we'll definitely see some standard operating ways emerging. So,
Very interesting. Yeah, same question for you, Michel, about the trend, but I want to add something to that question, jumping on what Arul just said about standards. Like, do you think there is a need as an industry to develop some standards, either on the vendor side, how you should build your private SaaS, and then how it should be exposed, to the user? Like, do you think that we need as an industry to come up with something that could unify the experience and make the use of it easier?
Yeah. So I would say that we probably want to go to the basics of why public SaaS became something. And the reason is, yes, there is all the development aspect, the quick releases, the bug fixes, etc. But there is also a huge problem into shipping software on an infrastructure that you know nothing about and where everybody is different. The reason why private SaaS is becoming something a lot more real and a lot more feasible, where you can basically get the best of both worlds, is just that the public cloud have taken over most of the infrastructure. And by doing so, they've removed a lot of the landscape is more homogeneous. You know what services you can access. And it means that instead of having to build a software for 500 different companies, you can just build a software for one company with the assumption that all the AWS services, all the Google services, all the Azure services are available. So you're still developing a software only once instead of 500 times. So for me, that's one of the reason why it's almost becoming a standard. Like, you expect to have access to this kind of services, and all the public clouds are offering some flavor of that. Some flavor of it. Now, what becomes interesting is also the type of technology that have come over the past few years. And here I'm thinking about Kubernetes, for example. One reason why it has taken the world is it had created an execution standard. Like, this is how you ship application, and this is how you make sure that you don't have to think about what type of instance you're running on, what type of database you're running, like how you do monitoring, how do you observability. It's just that these are fundamentals that are part of this platform. And the fact that now all the public cloud support Kubernetes is just a step forward for private cloud. It's just, you can ship software and you know how it's going to run, how it's going to scale, how you're going to observe it, how you're going to track and monitor it, and how you're going to log everything that's happening. And you're creating a framework for building application that you can ship. So I'm not sure I'm answering completely your question, but this is how I'm seeing the new standard that has happened. It's just the execution layer, the infrastructure layer is becoming more of a standard today.
Yeah, I think if I can add, I think that's a great point. Without something like Kubernetes, I don't think we could have developed any private SaaS like solution. So something like Kubernetes and the maturity and adoption of generally public cloud infrastructure has really become the tech enabler to enable enterprises now to think about private SaaS. So I think that's a very important tech enabler. I think, Sylvain, you asked about other standards. So I think it's about time for now some of these early private SaaS vendors to come together and maybe define some general standards. Because when you go to a new customer with the private SaaS infrastructure, we get some common questions around how are you handling data, how are you handling telemetry, what kind of audit do you generate, etc. So something like the SOC audit or some standard framework, it's important to bring it in. So any new private SaaS vendor, as long as they satisfies the standards, then they are good to go. So the security teams, InfoSec teams, CISOs can use that framework to assess the security readiness of a new private SaaS vendor. I think we are at a stage where it's time to put together some standard operating procedures, so the industry can easily assess different private SaaS vendors.
No, I think there's a lot to be said for that, because with, see the development evolution of Kubernetes, in a lot of cases, like, okay, there's been this Wild West phase, and now we kind of want to calm things down, standardization of practice. A lot of times there are things that are on a need-to-know basis. A developer doesn't have to know absolutely everything. There are guardrails with policies that keep them focused on the things that are actually important. When we talk, I remember asking once on Twitter, what's the most difficult thing about learning Kubernetes? And a lot of people responded, RBAC, role-based access control. So if we take that to the data area as well, a lot of times we're talking about threats, fear, risk, and data breaches. A lot of things that people think, like, I'm not really excited about learning this, and certainly hope it doesn't become my responsibility, because if something goes wrong, then there's a lot at stake there. I really like what you mentioned, though, Arul, is that for organizations that are in this position of moving towards private SaaS, how can some of these things become standardized, with community knowledge sharing around best practices, so that value can be delivered faster with fewer headaches and less of a feeling of, I need to learn absolutely everything. How can we move from a less of a threat-based, fear-based system and more around incentives on both sides, so that knowledge standards are brought to where they need to be? Both of you are, founders. If you're hiring folks, how can you know that they really understand this? We talk about certifications for organizations, but also for individuals, to make sure that everyone's on a level playing field, particularly in this international context. Where do you see these things going in the coming months and years, Michel, regarding standardization? What is it that's not happening right now that should be happening?
That's a good question. One thing that frightens companies for doing private SaaS is what we talked about before, which is you're losing visibility on the system. And this is probably the largest hindrance to doing private SaaS, because suddenly people have the same expectations they would have for a SaaS product, but you have less of that control over the software, over the upgrade, over the environment. So you're basically operating blind with similar expectation that people have for public SaaS. So in terms of product perception, that could be a problem, where someone changes a rule somewhere and it breaks your software. But people are not going to look at who changed the rule. They're going to look at, hey, your software stopped working. What's happening? And if I were to put things in order then, and to get people to feel good about, if I were to do any kind of standardization, it would be around the observability of the deployment. Because the moment you have this observability and it is baked into a standard, it means that this friction point of people saying, hey, but you have access to my observability data, and I don't know what you're doing with this data. The moment you have a standard, then there is almost like an agreement that this is how the world works today. You don't have to worry about it. We'll get the data that we need to operate the software. You can actually audit what we're looking at. But for me, that would be the first thing to do, which is, how do you operate the software rather than the software itself? And how do you give permission? How do you audit what the vendor is doing with that data? So that would probably be the way I would start. It's just foundational, which is, you're losing visibility. Let's recreate that visibility on the deployment.
And with that in mind, without that visibility, to be able to make proper decisions, to be able to understand all the other things that are going to happen, is going to be much, much more difficult. So how do we define that? How do we create a shared definition? I think what's very clear here is sort of, concluding the conversation, is that, private SaaS is very much here to stay and is going to grow, as Sylvain mentioned. Not that long ago, wasn't a lot about it. I think it's very clear that we can expect more, because when we're talking about topics of visibility, observability, data governance, ownership, organizations really wanting to dig deeper on that and to respect the regulations and to be scalable, internationally. If you're a startup and you really want to be expanding and you can't tackle these issues, or that your competitors can, well, you can't, even if maybe your technology is better, well, then that's a significant problem. So I think it's good to see that there's more interest going into this area, and that, as an industry, that standards need to be established, which is precisely why Sylvain and I are having these conversations. Start the revolution. But I really mean that I think it's with each conversation that we have with people that are located in different parts of the world with different backgrounds, it does seem to be increasingly clear that while there are efforts being made, towards regulation on the standardization side from those that are creating private SaaS that are, driving this, and for others that also want to get into it, maybe are like, maybe it's not for me. Say, no, this is how it's done. And it's just, there's not 10,000 ways to do this. There's, yes, there can be different flavors here and there, but in general, that these things can be standardized. I think that's something to look forward to. Sylvain, is there anything that I haven't mentioned that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think the big takeaway from me from this conversation is, we need to, as I think Arul said, or Michel, Arul I think said, like, we see other products also, just the naming convention, right? Like, there are companies doing it, but they use different marketing names, right? So just the naming might need something to be pushed. Maybe one of us, Arul and Michel, you need to give a talk at no, but really, because I do think I agree. Like, Kubernetes, is probably the key, or one of the key, in providing the standard to run any private SaaS application in an agnostic way, right? So I think it's a topic that needs to be discussed and agreed on the definition, and then you can go on the standard part. And as we know, naming thing is one of the hardest things in software. So,
and maybe just one thing we could ask is that it also creates new business model at that point, because in a pure deployment, you pay for a software license and then you pay for compute. For SaaS, you just pay for the service. Now you're basically having this hybrid type of pricing where the cost is not the burden. The cost of infrastructure is not the burden of the vendor, but the burden of the customer. And so it changes the pricing dynamics. And that's, if we're talking about standard, I would expect that at some point there will be a bit of a mixture between pure software shipping versus SaaS, and something that comes in the middle.
Yeah, I think we'll begin to see, like, if you go to the pricing page of these vendors, you'll begin to see maybe another column that talks about private SaaS. So it's emerging as a third way of delivering software delivery tools.
Product marketing people in fire.
Another column. I like column. No, I think that's, anyway, I think the insights that have been shared today are refreshing, and seeing that there is a direction that's being taken, and that we can expect more from this, given the regulatory landscape, given the things that we're seeing, and of course also from a business perspective of why this makes sense to consider as an option. Thank you both very much for your time today. We will be definitely having you back, so don't go too far. Remote contact helps, but hopefully we'll be crossing paths in person, whether it's in KubeCon in Chicago or some other kind of event, whether it's in the US or Europe. But thank you very much, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you, Sylvain.
Yeah, thanks for having us here. Thanks, Sylvain. Thanks, Bart. And Mitchell, nice meeting you here today.
Nice meeting you, Arul.